Welcome to the Young Widow Podcast. I'm Brittany, your host, and thank you for joining today for episode 10, Secondary Losses and Grief. I'm slightly off my podcast schedule, but I have a lot of requests coming in for specific podcasts that I put out on my Instagram. And so I want to work through some of those as quick as I can. And so we're going to off schedule post today on this. Secondary losses and grief. What are they? How do you work through them? And how can that make you feel emotionally? First, I think it's important to highlight what a secondary loss is. You lose your spouse, but a lot of times we don't talk about all of the other things that you lose when you become a widow. It could be relationships with family or friends. It could be your community. It could be the loss of your job or the loss of your home. There are so many secondary losses and grief, and it can actually compound our grief and the weight of our emotions, and it can make us really struggle to work through the initial grief and then what is also compounding it. Today, I'm going to talk about a couple different secondary losses. I think it's important to say that I may not have all the same secondary losses you have, and I can only talk from my perspective or my perspective in working with other widows within my coaching program. Some of the secondary losses that we're going to work through today are going to be losses in relationships with family and friends, loss of community, loss of house, loss of job. And then we're going to tie it all together in the end with the loss of sense of security and how that compounds your grief. So let's get started and jump in. This is going to be a little bit longer of a podcast than what I normally do. For this podcast, I'm going to go through each type of secondary loss and my experience with it, and then my recommendation, which is a little bit different structure than what I normally do. But with that, the first type of secondary loss that I want to talk about is the loss of relationship with family members. For me specifically, I didn't lose relationship with my immediate family, my family that was my bloodline, but I did feel a sense of loss of relationship with the family of my in-laws, my husband's family. And why? Well, my husband had died, and while we were trying to stay connected, at the same point, we all started going about and carrying on our lives, right? And there's a point where you can keep up the relationship, but it really has to be both parties. And if it's only one party moving it forward, then eventually what happens is the relationship starts to fade out. It can make us feel like we did something wrong, but I think it's important to delineate some facts around this first. So in my personal instance, I appreciate my husband's family. I've always appreciated them and the attempts that we have all made about keeping our relationship going forward. But when you become a widow or widower, there are a lot of things that you have to take on, right? You have to take on the financial responsibility of your family. If you have children, you have to become a solo parent. You have to figure out how to live in the day in and day out. While you're doing all those things, you're trying to grieve. And then you're also trying to maintain the relationships of your friends and then the relationships of your own family as well. Sometimes I think it's important to say that there's just too much on the plate. And it doesn't mean that there has to be hard feelings around it, right? In the first 2 years after my husband died, I was very cognizant of his family and their feelings. I made sure to message them on every holiday. I made sure to write down birthdays and message them. But then I was also trying to be cognizant and message them off cycle. And what does that mean? I would just try and say, hey, just wanted to say hi, see how your day is going, and just talk about normal life. We actually got in a really good cycle of doing this. I would talk to my husband's dad probably every week or multiple times a week. Then slowly after the 2 year mark into the 3 year mark, it started to fade off, but it wasn't intentional. And I will say it was on both parts, right? It wasn't intentional, but he was spending time with his other children and he was moving houses. I was trying to figure out how to run a business and take care of my daughter and work a full-time job, but came to a point where I didn't feel like I needed to talk to him every week. You know, in the early stages of grief, he would always say, there's going to be a time where you're going to move on. And when you move on, you're just going to forget about us. And I would always say, no, that's not going to happen. I'm never going to forget about you. I'm going to move forward in my life, but I'm not going to forget about you. And I think that's a fine line to walk, right? Like I am moving forward in my life and in my grief, and I haven't forgot about them, but they aren't the center of my everyday. We're going on 5 years into it, and at some point I have to establish a type of normal. Well, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to hold a relationship going forward with them because they are a part of our family. They are related to my daughter. They are her aunts and uncles. They are her grandma and grandpa. They are her cousins and her nieces and nephews. And so it's important for her to always have that connection. I have felt that way, that I will always have a connection to them for my daughter because it's important for her to have that. And I need to carry that on for my husband. But my daily life isn't centered around them. When we talk about secondary losses related to family members, my situation is specific to in-laws, which is actually a pretty big one in widowhood because we all have in-laws, right? I don't have a situation specific to my family members. I want to talk about secondary losses in relationships outside of family, which are usually your friends, right? So I did have secondary losses related to my friends. Some of those losses happened immediately after my husband died, and then some of them took time to fizzle out. A lot of times in grief, we can lose people in relationships because of the grief we're going through, and they're not able to comprehend it. What do I mean by that? Maybe you have somebody in your life who you thought was going to be there for you, and then your spouse died, and all of a sudden they're just no longer there. They're not showing up, they're not messaging, and you're really just kind of wondering why. Maybe you have somebody that was there for you in the early stages of grief, but over the first couple months, maybe even into the first couple of years, their presence slowly started to fizzle out. And maybe you're asking yourself why. I think it's important to say that in grief, our grief can be very overwhelming for everybody else around us. I've talked about this a little bit in my other podcast, but spousal loss is a really deep grief to go through. And for our friends or family to watch us go through that can be very straining on them. Sometimes they don't know what to say to us. They don't know how to console us. They don't know what to do. And so because they feel like there's nothing they can do, they just stop showing up. When in reality, what you need them to do is just show up and be there, right? But if you don't verbalize that to them, then you can't really be upset that they've kind of fizzled out of your life. I went through some instances with friends who were there significantly in the beginning after I lost my husband, and I relied on them for a lot. And in my early days of grief, I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on them, for lack of a better term. My expectations were probably high. They probably felt like they couldn't tell me no. And so they really felt like they were just stuck in my grief with me. And over time, probably about at the 1 year mark and then into the 2 year mark, I really started realizing that I was putting unneeded weight on them. And so I stopped asking them to do things. And when I did that, the relationship really started to fizzle out and they kind of went their own way. Initially, I was hurt by it, but then I realized that they needed to heal from the trauma that I had put them through. Because yes, I had put them through trauma, and the trauma they had to deal with was witnessing me through my deep grief period. And it was emotionally overwhelming for them. That's the feedback that I've gotten. I think that it's important to say that when we go through this period with friends or family where we lose them, we tend to feel abandoned in our grief. We don't understand why they're not showing up anymore. We don't understand why they're not a significant part of our life. And so we feel abandoned and we take it to heart because it is a secondary loss in our grief and it can compound our feelings, right? But it's also important to take a step back and say, but what does that person need? Because in the end, we all have to be cognizant of what we need for ourselves. And if that person isn't able to balance a relationship with you through your grief, it's important to let them go and then work on not having hard feelings around that, which is really hard to do. But maybe they're not meant to be here for your whole grief journey. Maybe they are meant to go their own way. And so they served the purpose and they did everything that they could do, but now they're not able to do anymore. And it's important to acknowledge when they feel that way and say, in this moment, I can't be selfish for myself. I know that I have said to be selfish in your grief, but when it comes to relationships, you really can't be selfish because you can't force somebody to be there for you. And so the mentality that you need to have with that is exactly that. You can't force somebody to be in your life. And you may not want to lose them because you already lost your spouse, but you can't hold them hostage. You have to let them go if that's what's best for them and if that's what they want to do. Sometimes that can be really hard if you don't have closure in it. I'm a very vocal person. I like to talk. And I think that you could have closure if you just reached out and asked and if you just initiated the closure yourself. Maybe you're struggling with letting those relationships with friends or family go. I think there's 2 points there. One, you could reach out and ask for closure. Or two, you could take on the mentality that you don't need to understand why. If they've walked away, you don't have to understand why they made that decision. They don't owe that to you, and they're allowed to make that decision based off of free will. Now, both of those examples together, I talked about family, I talked about friends. I really roll them under one because they both have to do with relationships, right? And our friends and our family members are close to us. The loss of either of those can and likely will compound your grief. It could make you feel like you're going through the grief of your spouse all over again and really open up those raw wounds of loss. What is important is that you identify that it is different than losing your spouse. It is your supporting network, but it is not your spouse. And so you do have the ability to build another supporting network. It's going to be hard. It's going to take time, but you're going to build a network with people that want to be around you in your grief. that can support you for where you are now in your grief. And I think that that's the most important thing out of relationships. It really took me almost 5 years to learn that, but I really allow relationships to ebb and flow in and out of my life now. And I will say, because I just allow that to happen and I allow people to leave, I am overall a more happy person and I invest more in my relationships that have stuck around. The second topic I want to talk about is secondary loss around your house. Now, this is a physical object. Not everybody's going to actually lose their house, but there is an emotional aspect to this as well. So when my husband died, I didn't lose my house. I still had my house, and I lived in it for a year and a half after he died. I didn't lose the physical aspect of my house, but I did lose the emotional aspect of it. And what I mean by that is that it didn't fully feel like home, and it didn't because I built this home with my husband. It was the first house that we bought. We lived in this house for 8 years. There were a ton of memories there. And while those memories still existed within the house for me, my husband wasn't physically there. And so it really was this overwhelming emotional feeling of losing my home. After a year and a half, I decided to move. And I decided to move because I felt like I just needed to start over in a new town with my daughter and really figure out what our life was together. And so I didn't physically lose my home. I emotionally lost my house. With that, I do work with some widows in my coaching program that actually did lose their house. And they lost their house because they couldn't financially provide for themselves and their family to keep the house that they bought or to keep the house that they lived in and were renting. And so they were forced to move. And they felt like they were forced to move before they were emotionally ready. That physical loss of the house actually compounded their grief. Maybe it happened a month after their spouse died or 6 months after their spouse died, and they were forced to pack everything up. And there was no option for them to stay. And when that happened, it triggered them into a significant grief cycle because they were grieving the loss of their spouse and now grieving the loss of their house. For some of them, they were able to stay in the town that they lived in. And for some of them, they actually not only moved cities, they had to move states. And so when they lost the house, they also lost their sense of community, their neighborhood, and everything they knew around them where their life had existed. And it's something that they're still working through today. From my perspective, with all the widows that I work with in my coaching program that physically lost their house, even a year or 2 years later, the emotions around that are really raw. While they have moved and they have started their life over, when they recall that situation, it brings them back into early grief and emotions that they're unable to control because they feel like that was stolen from them in their early grief. So how do you work through the secondary loss of your physical home? In order to work through that, what you really have to do is sit down and outline all of the things that make you feel attached to that place and what you got from it. Maybe it was a sense of community with your neighborhood. Maybe it was all the memories within the house. Or maybe the root cause of it was a feeling of a loss of sense of security. This is a place where you lived with your spouse. You no longer had that and you were forced to move. And so you lose the security net of what is your normal day-to-day life. Once you make that list, how you work through that is you identify all of the triggers associated to that. Whenever there's a significant grief cycle related to that, you go to the list, you look at the things you could control. 9 times out of 10, if you physically lost your house, it was something that was out of your control. And because you couldn't control it, you can't allow yourself to center on it. Because if you do that mentally, you will never move past that hurdle. And then that's how you reconcile it within your brain. The third type of secondary loss I want to talk about here is the loss of your job. I did do a short post of this on my Instagram. While I did not lose my job, I did go into a fight or flight mode with my job. About 45 minutes after my husband died, I remember calling my boss and saying, "You can't fire me. I need my job right now. My husband's dead, but I can't get on a plane to Chicago." So why did I do that? Well, my husband died and I was supposed to be getting on a plane to Chicago that morning in order to meet clients for my company. And as soon as my husband died, I went through this thought process of what am I supposed to be doing right now? Oh my God, I'm supposed to be getting on a plane. I can't go meet these clients because my husband just died. I can't leave. And so I called my boss in a complete emotional breakdown and I was like, "Please don't fire me. My husband died. I really need this job to provide for my family." Luckily at the time I had a good boss and a company that was understanding of that. And so they gave me time off to work through my initial and early grief. But that's not always the case, right? I have 2 widows that I currently work with in my coaching program that both ended up losing their job. Now, they didn't lose their job initially. They got their bereavement leave, but they lost their job over time within the first year. And the reason why they lost their job is because they weren't able to operate in the daily mentality and life that their job needed them to do. They weren't present in their job, and they really struggled with being present in their job when they couldn't even be present in their own life. They're going through deep and active grieving for months after their husband died, and they weren't able to really fall back into that work mindset and produce at the level that the company needed them to. And so the company had decided to part ways for them. For both of them, it was really traumatic because they were the sole financial provider for their family now. They had children, and then they lost their job. It really compounded their emotions around grief because now they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? How am I going to provide for my family? How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to take care of my children? I've lost my job because I'm in this grief haze and I can't think throughout the day, and I'm really just on autopilot mode. They also felt like they had a loss of sense of community because they were friends with their coworkers. Their coworkers were people that supported them. And so they felt like they lost that network and connection. They were dealing with all of this at one time while they were also grieving for the loss of their spouse. How do you work through those compounded emotions? I think the first thing is it's important for all of us, even if you're not grieving, to not tie your self-worth to a job or position. While that job and that career pays for your lifestyle, your self-worth shouldn't be tied to it. And what do I mean by that? You are an individual, you are a person, you have needs, and you are human. You're going to go through things in life that don't align with your current job. And when it doesn't, you need to be okay letting go and walking away because it's not what you need. Your self-worth should never be tied to a job or position. The second one is that if the company is unwilling to work with you through your active grieving phase, maybe much like a friend or family member, that is not what you need right now. Maybe you need to find a better cultured environment for what you're going through and something that's more conducive to your new lifestyle. Just because you had that job before your spouse died doesn't mean that it fits the lifestyle now, because your lifestyle is very different. The third thing is that you can find another job, but it's also important to know where you're at emotionally so this doesn't happen again when you get another job. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, but Brittany, it's not that easy. There are jobs, but it is hard to find one. What do you do in the interim until you find a job? And I can't give you all of that advice because I don't know your individual financial situation. But I will say, where there is a will, there is a way. Sometimes in life, even people that aren't going through loss, we have to take on positions or jobs that are temporary that get us to where we need to be in the meantime. They just fill a void for right now. And they may be below our skill set. They may not be in the career field that we want to be in, but it meets the intent. And the intent is having income coming in to take care of your financial responsibilities. And so if this is a place that you're at where you've lost your job or you think you're going to lose your job, it's okay to look at intermediary positions. It's okay to take a job outside of what you normally would to meet the intent of what you need right now, while you look for a future home in a position where you can stay at long term. I will say that this is tied to ego a little bit, right? Nobody wants to take a job below them. Nobody wants to take a job that's not at the level of the position that they had. But in grief, you have to let your ego go and you have to say, this is only temporary and it's just what I need right now. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to come back from it. That doesn't mean that I failed. A lot of us don't have that mentality, but it is a survival mode. We talked about three main secondary losses there: loss of family and friend relationships, loss of home, and loss of job, with a little bit of sprinkling of how community fits in there. The last thing I really want to talk about to tie it all together is an understanding that you're going to have a secondary loss of a sense of security. What do I mean by that? When you are married, you're in a relationship where you both solve problems together. You both contribute to the house and the family in some way or form, whether you both had jobs, somebody was a stay-at-home, and somebody went to work. Regardless of what it is, you worked together in that, right? You made decisions, you created a life together, and you relied on each other to get through life. Well, when your spouse dies, you no longer have that. And it can really feel like a loss in a sense of security. Like somebody took the safety net out from underneath you, and now you could just fall, and there's nobody to stop you from falling. But I would correct that mindset and say there is somebody to stop you from falling, and that person is yourself. There are plenty of people in the world that aren't in relationships that figure out how to be independent and how to survive on their own. Now, you may never have wanted that because you wanted to live with your spouse, but this is where you're at now, and so you have to be comfortable being independent. You have to put mechanisms into place that allow you to have a sense of security. Maybe it's investments, maybe it's a savings account, maybe it's relying on a close friend to be somebody that you can bounce opinions off of because you used to do that with your spouse, but you don't have that anymore. Whatever loss of sense of security you're feeling now, the steps forward are to figure out what those are and then figure out how to build yourself a sense of security. And so, what you can do to work through that is you can create a list of all of the things that you feel insecure about. And then you can make sub bullets of what actions can I put in place in order to negate this sense of insecurity. For me, that's what I did for myself. And I help other widows in my coaching work through that and figure out what the triggers are for a sense of insecurity and how we could put mechanisms into place that way they don't feel that way going forward. Regardless of what you decide to do, I will say the loss of sense of security will stick around for a significant amount of time. I put a lot of mechanisms in place after my husband died so I would feel more secure in my life. And I am almost 5 years into my grief now, and I still have days where I feel insecure and I wish I had that safety net to rely on, but I don't. If you're 2, 3, 4, maybe you're 5 or 7 years into your grief and you still feel like you're insecure and you're doing something wrong, I'm just here to validate your feelings and that resonate with that. It's going to be something that you're going to have to grow into. And I know in grieving, we don't like the word growth, but that is what happens over time. You do grow in and around your grief, and sense of security is something that you learn to provide for yourself. All in all, a little bit longer of a podcast. It may have seemed a little bit scattered because I just got a request in for that and wanted to quickly record it, as it's something that a lot of my followers can relate to. If you're going through the loss of a spouse and you feel like there are a lot of secondary losses in your life that are compounding your grief, that is probably true. You probably are also dealing with secondary losses. And my best advice is to sit down, make a list of all the secondary losses that you feel like you're dealing with, and then prioritize what is triggering it and the best way to hold a conversation about it, and then what steps you can do moving forward. So, with that, thank you for joining me for my off cycle podcast. I will still be back on Wednesday and we'll chat then. I hope you have a great week.